We continue with the reading of Sanitation in Communion by Dr. James Orton and evangelist Alton Bailey. In this section, the authors continue with science and sanitation in communion. First, we have a song. Although Jack Konowalczyk and Joan Spears of the Canadian Bureau of Microbial Hazards were not studying communion, their research is often cited in this regard. Earlier studies by these scholars had investigated the power of various fruit extracts to inactivate different types of viruses. The one reviewed here did the same for grapes and wines. These researchers prepared 2 milliliter bottles of red wines, white wines, commercial grape juice, Welch's, whole fresh grapes homogenized in water, and raisin infusion, water in which raisins had been soaked for 24 hours. Cultured polio, echo, coxsackie, and herpes viruses were deposited in the test bottles in batches of 8,000 plaque-forming units. Counts were taken at periods from 1 hour through 24 hours. They monitored the effects of the substances over longer blocks of time rather than in minutes as in the other studies, because they were interested in the effect of the compounds on microorganisms in human digestive systems, not in possible spread of disease in communion. For the same reason, no tests were made on cup rims or with silver or other types of containers. All of the grape substances had an inhibiting effect on the viruses. The strength and rapidity of the effect varied with the type of virus and the substance. Raisin water and white wines were least effective. Pure grape juice was clearly the most effective. In general, polio and herpes viruses were inactivated more quickly and to larger extent. For example, polio virus was reduced to 1/10 its former count after 24 hours incubation in pure grape juice. As far back as the 1st century, people believed that wine had purifying properties. Roman soldiers are said to have mixed wine with drinking water in the countries they conquered in the belief that the alcohol in the wine would purify the water. It may have helped, but if so, it was not due to the alcohol. This and other studies have shown that it is the phenols in and near the skins of the fruit that possess this power. The reason red wines are more effective than white is that red wines are made by fermenting the whole fruit, including the skins, whereas white wines are processed from juice only. Apparently, the fermentation reduces some of the power of the fruit since pure juice is more effective than red wines. One value of this study is that it explains certain findings from other studies. For example, when the wine remaining after communion has been tested, it's found to be practically sterile. This is puzzling because even unused cups and healthy mouths are not ordinarily sterile. The probable explanation is that unused wine is usually tested from 1 to several hours after the communion service, long enough to allow the phenols in the wine or grape juice to produce this effect. Gregory, Carpenter, and Bending, a study with methodological problems. Two of the above researchers were from the University of Guelph in Canada, and the third was from Loma Linda University in California. They state that their work was intended to test whether good quality wine and silver communion cups would rapidly kill microorganisms. A variety of experiments were conducted. In one test, 4 types of cultured organisms were placed on a silver cup rim and in wine contained in a silver cup. The rim and the wine were checked intermittently for an hour. The efficacy of wiping the cup rim was tested by placing organisms on a cup, allowing them to dry, wiping with a cloth, and swabbing for viruses. Then, 30 university student volunteers simulated a communion service, and the cup rim was checked for organisms. The researchers also took saliva from volunteers' mouths, inoculated it with cultured organisms, and deposited droplets of it directly into the wine. These droplets were later retrieved and tested for growth or decline of the organisms. Gregory, Carpenter, and Bending concluded that silver had no effect on test organisms. Wiping the cup was of very little value in reducing organisms on the cup, and a variety of organisms were found on the cup after the simulated communion. Droplets of the virus-infused saliva recovered from the wine showed an increase in numbers. They did find that wine was strongly antiviral on 3 of the 4 test organisms. They concluded that the common communion cup and its contents could serve effectively as vehicles for rapid transmission of disease organisms. If one assumes that all researchers were honest, how could these authors achieve such different findings and arrive at far different conclusions than Hobbs, Knowlton, and White, and from Burroughs and Hemmings? It may not be so difficult as it seems. In the first place, although these experiments were described as similar to those of other researchers, they actually were quite different. For example, Burroughs and Hemmings wiped the cup right after communicants had drunk, the real-life procedure in churches that use this practice. Gregory and the others placed virus preparations on the cup rim, allowed them to dry, and then wiped. It seems easy to understand why a dry cloth would not be effective in removing dried solutions. These authors' test of the cup after simulated communion was not the same as in other studies, nor was it a valid research procedure. They say, quote, a variety of bacteria was covered from the surface, end quote. But they give no counts of any types of bacteria, and they did not test an unused cup as a control. Remember that the London experiment recovered more bacteria from some unused control cups than from cups used by several communicants. This finding could have been announced before the experiment was done. There are bacteria on all surfaces that have not been sterilized and sealed. In the form reported, the findings of this study are worthless. Gregory and the others exhibit 2 of the most common failures of scientists. Number 1, sloppy work. And number two, drawing conclusions beyond their data. Almost every task can be done well or poorly, a fact that is as true of science as of auto repair. For instance, they acknowledge not having read Burroughs and Hemmings before conducting their work, even though the former had been a standard reference in the field for 20 years. One of the canons of science is that one becomes familiar with what others have done on the subject before beginning an experiment. The purpose is to build on others' strengths and avoid their mistakes. These authors' carelessness is evinced in conclusions that were well beyond their data, some of which now make them appear foolish. Another example that now must be very embarrassing is Gregory Carpenter and Bending's assertion that churches that use pure grape juice rather than fermented wine are at even greater risk. There can be little doubt, nevertheless, that wine is safer from the epidemiological point of view, they write, than unfermented grape juice would be in a common communion cup, end quote. Since they did not test grape juice in comparison to wine, they were going beyond their data to make this conclusion. It was based on the common sense notion that the alcohol in the wine is the effective agent. One hopes that by now they have read Konowalczyk and Spears. Unless scientists discipline themselves to be good scholars, they are no more immune to prejudice than ordinary folks. The most useful and up-to-date information on the danger of disease transmission by the common communion cup is contained in a report by Noel Gill in 1987 from the London Public Health Laboratory, the agency that produced the Hobbs, Knowlton, and White study 20 years earlier. Gill did not conduct research himself. Instead, he reviewed approximately 100 experimental studies and clinical reports on most known transmissible diseases, giving special attention to AIDS. These state-of-the-art reviews, when done by competent scholars, are more valuable to laymen than individual original studies. Because much more data is assembled, its quality readily can be assessed. Findings can be compared and conclusions realistically made. Such matters as routes of disease transmission and sites of entry into the body often emerge. Field studies done in the real world are especially valuable. An example of findings from the field relates to transmission of Streptococcus bacteria. Although these organisms are frequently found in human saliva, airborne droplets entering nasal passages rather than mouth-to-mouth contact are believed to be the major route of transmission. This conclusion is supported by the fact that hospital ward-acquired cases are reduced by placing beds at least 8 feet apart. These studies indicate that a suitable site and means of entry into the body are needed for infection, and those vary with the type of organism. For example, diseases that do infect by mouth, typhoid, salmonellosis, and others, are usually gotten from contaminated food or water, in which the concentration of bacteria are very high, not from other persons. Several follow-up studies of individuals who were exposed to hepatitis B by direct mouth-to-mouth contact revealed no cases of transmission. During the infective preclinical phase, just before coming down with the disease, a music teacher shared wind instruments with 12 students. A follow-up of the students showed that none developed the illness. In 2 separate incidents, students in 2-day cardiopulmonary resuscitation courses practiced on the same life-size dolls with a member of each group who was clinically infected with hepatitis B. Several students served as mouth-to-mouth practice partners with the infected persons. none of the 39 participants, 18 in one group and 21 in another, none of them developed the disease. Gill reviewed studies in which direct attempts were made to infect chimpanzees with the HIV virus. In one study, concentrations of the HIV virus, were placed into the chimp's mouths, and their teeth and gums brushed to the point of bleeding. No case of HIV infection took place. Experiments like this support the U.S. Centers for Disease Control's statement that the AIDS virus is not transmitted by mouth-to-mouth contact. Based on the studies noted above and many similar ones, Gill concluded that the risk of infection via the communion cup is negligible, noting that, quote, no episode of disease attributable to the shared communion cup has ever been reported. He stated that there is no scientific support for suggesting that the practice of sharing a communion cup should be abandoned, end quote. The preceding studies are the only ones revealed by a computer search of relevant literature indexes that appear worthy of review. The earliest of these was Burroughs and Hemmons, 1943, and as is incumbent upon good scholars, they carefully assessed all previously published works. Although the communion cup controversy was then a half-century old, Burroughs and Hemmons noted that there was, quote, a remarkable scarcity of experimental evidence, end quote. This finding is not surprising. The state of knowledge, methods of study, and equipment were all crude by today's standards. But it should be instructive to observe the basis on which the great controversy came about. Two vehement warriors in the battle for individual cups were doctors named Charles Forbes and H.S. Anders. Forbes did not publish his work, but he made speeches, for example, to the Rochester Pathological Society in April 1894, and he was widely quoted in newspapers. The New York Times carried articles on the controversy for a decade. Anders, described as a, quote, passionate advocate, end quote, for individual cups, was a prolific writer. Around 1900, he engaged in a debate with a British doctor through the medical journals. The emotional and demeaning quality of the exchange made it clear that this was no objective scientific discussion. A few years later, a man named C.G. Page entered the fray. By observing how these men worked and noting the types of bacteria they found, Burroughs and Hemmons concluded that what they were seeing was the remnants of ordinary house dust. They compared the findings to what a first-year bacteriology student might see in his microscope after exposing a clean agar plate to air for several days. Alas, the great controversy in the religious world and the division in the Lord's church came about over fear of ordinary house dust. House dust, which the average human breathes in hundreds of times a day. What troubles could have been avoided if the religious world would have waited in faith for a few short years? Because there is so much material, we are tempted to go on giving competent medical opinions on this issue. There are Edward Dancewicz's comments from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Referring to the Hobbs, Knowlton, and White study and acknowledging its quality, Dancewicz agreed with them that there is little cause for alarm. We could call attention to a recent question in a German medical journal about the possibility of AIDS transmission via the communion cup. The questioner asks about the worst-case scenario, assuming the patient had bleeding mouth sores. Professor Dr. Maas responded that there is little probability of infection and cited evidence the disease is not transmitted that way. And we could refer readers to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control's pamphlets and fact service memos that cites studies showing that family members who live with AIDS patients shared food utensils, razors, and even toothbrushes did not catch the disease. But what benefit would still more evidence give? There is a point at which additional proof serves no good purpose. Jesus found this situation with the scribes and Pharisees, who kept demanding more and more signs of his divinity. No one can absolutely guarantee a Christian or anyone else that he will not get a disease. There are so many factors, often unknown factors, that influence a human body. But if he does get a disease, the best evidence is that it will not be from drinking out of the common communion cup. We agree with Dr. O. Noel Gill of the British Public Health Service that the fact that no disease has ever been shown to come from the common cup is strong evidence of its safety. If no case of illness has been traced to the communion cup in 100 years, the chance of being the first victim seems less than that of being hit by a falling meteor. One of the pioneer preachers said that he was more afraid of the vengeance of God for defying his will than he was of germs. We are too. And in addition, we trust the love and power of our God to protect us more than that of physicians, even beloved physicians, like those named in the back of this booklet. God is the great physician. I am the Lord that healeth thee. In conclusion, we would like to return to the themes emphasized earlier in this booklet. There is strong biblical evidence that Jesus understood microorganisms and diseases at the time he lived on earth. His love for mankind was demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. The Bible also is clear about how the Master established his supper, with 1 loaf of bread and 1 cup of the fruit of the vine, a fact upon which most knowledgeable Christians agree. The scientific community, after a century of maturation, generally has come to terms with the way the Lord organized the communion, no longer seeing it as a hazard to health. Finally, our carefulness in keeping the Lord's Supper as delivered should not obscure its purpose. That grand goal is our spiritual growth through a loving remembrance of the body that was given and the blood that was shed for the remission of our sins. Isaiah 55, verse 9. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Stay with us on how to get a copy of this message after our song. contact us for a free copy of number 1250, Sanitation in Communion. For a more detailed doctrinal account, you may also request a free copy of the booklet Unity in One Loaf and One Cup, featuring quotes from the Gospel Advocate Commentary, Alexander Campbell, Barton W. Stone, J.W. McGarvey, and James D. Bales. This material also features quotations from the New York Times on the history of individual cups in the United States and E.W. Bullinger's Figures of Speech in the Bible, dealing with the issue of metonymy. Joseph Thayer, W.E. Vine, and Bauer, Danker, Art, and Gingrich are Greek scholarly reference materials that bring clarity to the Greek underlying the relevant scriptures. Of course, we offer a free Bible study course that you can complete at home. You may visit letthebiblespeak.com to access transcripts, audio, and video of 500 sermons. We hope you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we welcome your comments and questions to this series as well as any of our other programming. Finally, we echo the sentiment of the Apostle Paul when he wrote in Romans 16, verse 16, "The churches of Christ salute you." Until next week, goodbye, and may God bless you.